some money at the moment and working, and then I decided to graduate next year. Yeah, for sure.
And you graduate after, so you start in February?
Hello. Welcome everyone. Okay. It's time to start. Please join us. You can use a sofa or the stairs. First, I would like to start talking briefly about the format. So the format of today, we will have an in-conversation, and we have Omar Degan here. First, there will be 20 minutes presentation for him. Then afterwards, we will have some discussions from each one of the panelists, bringing up one question. And afterwards, we will open the room for everyone to bring up also questions. So just make sure you have it handy. First, let's start with Omar. And I'm going to read your presentation because it's worth to read. Omar Degan is an internationally recognized architect, curator, academic, and global expert in architecture in fragile contexts. He's the founder and principal of DO Architectural Group, the first internationally recognized architecture practice from Somalia. His firm operates globally, transforming architecture into a tool for resilience, identity, and justice, with projects spanning from humanitarian design to cultural reconstruction. Over more than a decade, Degan has worked across Africa, Europe, South and North America, and Asia, addressing the intersection between design, crisis, and cultural resilience. His practice challenges conventional architecture discourse by centering communities, often excluded from it, turning fragility into a framework for innovation, inclusion, and dignity. At 2022 Obama Foundation leader and 2018 Tech Talk speaker, Degan has collaborated with leading international organizations, including UNHABITAT, the International Organization for Migration, Save the Children, the Italian Agency for Cooperation, and the European Union, advancing architectural responses to displacement, conflict, and climate vulnerability. As the founder and curator of the inaugural Pan-Africa Biennale, most of the important reason we invited him today here, the first continental biennale in Africa dedicated to architecture, Degan leads a movement to reclaim Africa as the epicenter of global architectural thought, under the theme, shifting the center from fragility to resilience. The Biennale redefines architecture as an act of resistance, a space for collective reimagining, open access, and radical inclusion. And now you might wonder why I'm debating and opening this moderation, and it's because we are starting this project of centering designing otherwise, which together with BK program building audiences, we are very happy to welcome Omar to teach us a bit about how this Biennale is going.
Thank you so much. Okay. What? No. I prefer the microphone. I thought it was so I can move around as I prefer. So while I am going to show you something initially, I just want to take a brief to thank everyone that comes in here, but also to apologize in advance to what I'm going to say, which is not going to be politically correct, is not going to be that much conventional. I'm not going to use architecture as a central core of this, but architecture would be the frame of telling a story, because I think as architects, we forgot that the real core of architecture is something more than having cute buildings. But to contextualize a bit what I am talking about, I want to show you briefly this video of the father, also defined, of African cinema.
Est-ce que vos films sont bien compris en Europe?
Non, mais mettons-nous bien ça dans la tête. Moi, l'Europe n'est pas mon centre. L'Europe est une périphérie de l'Afrique. Vous voyez, ils sont restés plus de 100 ans chez moi, ils n'ont pas parlé ma langue, je parle leur langue. L'avenir, pour moi, l'avenir ne dépend pas d'être compris par l'Europe. Je souhaiterais qu'ils me comprennent, mais ça ne me fait absolument rien. Si vous prenez la carte de l'Afrique, géographiquement, vous pouvez mettre l'Europe et l'Amérique, il nous resterait encore de la place. Pourquoi voulez-vous que ce tropisme, vous savez, le tropisme, pourquoi voulez-vous que je sois comme le tournesol qui tourne autour du soleil? Je suis moi-même le soleil.
So the last part is mentioning I am the sun. So the rest is rotated around me. But why I'm showing you this is to set a bit the discourse and showing to you what I'm actually aiming to do in here. So this is the title of the first Pan-African Architecture Biennale, which I will reach the why of this. But before that, I think it's important for me to set a bit, as someone says, the stage and showing to you a bit of context. So to go back to the thing, Africa was always the center. The world just forgot it. Or at least pretended to. And why I'm saying that? Well, I'm saying that because in 1884, with the famous scramble from Africa, the European nations came together and they decided to, as a sort of piece of cake, dividing the whole African continent. But despite what the word remember, colonization actually started quite a bit before with the Portuguese in Ceuta in current days Morocco. And why is that important? Because as already appeared in here quite clear, the narration and the reality between the two things are quite different. So as I am in Holland now, I wanted to also highlight and bring in back the fact that Dutch were part of this crumble of Africa, part of the discourse, part of the colonization, not only with the first colony in South Africa in 1615, but also later on also part of this broader slave trade of the Atlantic Ocean. And this is important to set a bit the stage and understanding the why these things happen and what they brought together with that. Some of the effects, which are still contingent on the history of the world of today, started with obviously the segregation of settlements in South Africa, where we started to see, the white South African and the black South African started to be divided, which is a kind of traditional thing in all the colonial powers, to dividing what they call the indigenous people from their own colonial entities. And that escalated in different way to compromise in the way of living, so the space is already touched, as we see from this example. But then escalated broadly in persecution, racial division, internal conflict, imprisonment, all the way up to then what we know, the rise of Nelson Mandela and becoming the president of the back then South Africa, and then creating reconciliation. Why this is very important? Because it's important to set a frame, a time frame of these things. So if we put together all the years that African countries have been colonized by European nations, we reach the astonishing number of 5,751 years under colonial power of the whole continent, which then, if compared that with the years of independence, we just reached the number of 3,229. So as a comparison, you can see how current African nations, they've saw the sort of independence for a very brief period of time. But again, when we talk about Africa all the time, we tend to talk about this temporal framework. And I'm here today to highlight something that has every book. This is just a chapter of a very broader book, which started way before. I'm pretty sure the majority of you know about Marco Polo, the explorer, which went from Venice all the way to China, and is considered the greater explorer of all the time, which actually spent 17 years exploring this route. But very few know Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan explorer, which actually 100 years before the first colonization of Africa traveled around the Muslim world, describing a continental situation that is very different to what then the colonial power decided to define. And that per se creates a big contradiction. In fact, in places like Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, which is now one of the most fragile cities in the world, or often defined that, Ibn Battuta recognized that as a city rich with merchants, with a great architecture. And if that wasn't enough, the city of Kilwa, again. So what does that tell us? That the colonial powers changed totally the history of what actually a continent was, and the kingdoms, and and all the richness that it was in there, defined it often as an uncivilized part of the world, as, with the intent, going there with the intent of bringing new civilization. But yet, as in this photo by Dr. Robert Altman, we saw the British colonizer, the British forces in what was back then Benin city. So, and those so-called uncivilized nation then seems that they had something a bit more important to share. In fact, probably majority of the museums around the world, they wouldn't be like the center of knowledge if the knowledge was not coming from the places that this nation colonized. And the British Museum is one of those, with the example of, that I think a lot of people are familiar with, the Bronze of Benin. But the Bronze of Benin, they just highlight one of the things, that artifacts and story was taken, which is a more concrete way to define it, but yet we also forget one very important point, that history of architecture was actually destroyed in that. And in fact, in this picture, you can see what is the remaining, in terms of documentation, of the walled city of Benin, which was an example of extraordinary urban development, cities, and urban planning, which then was deliberately destroyed by the British during their attack. So what does that mean broadly? Well, that knowledge has been taken away, that history has been taken away, and as often you hear, is history is in the hands of the winners. But I think that this discourse of who are the winner is kind of changing. So if Africa was the cradle of life, its architecture was the first language of existence. And this is to say that way before colonial power came to get parts of Africa, there was already empires, there were already trade, there were emperor. And if each one of you that now have a phone, romantically, each one of you is part of this African history because the first human being came from Africa. But more practically, you wouldn't be able now to take a photo of this presentation if it wasn't for the resources that comes from Africa as well. So what this is to say that, yes, there was Mali, Burkina Faso, Tunisia. For the one of you that are a bit more of a nerd side like me, if you are familiar with Star Wars, this was actually part of the set of Star Wars. So Africa was already in the future before future came to us. Ethiopia, Somalia, all of this to simply say, together Tanzania, that African architecture does not exist. And how could it exist? 54 nations, more than 3,000 languages spoken, an incredible number of diversity, 8 climate zones. Would be like a joke to think about African architecture exists. And if African architecture exists, I should start to mention that, hey, European architecture. Pretty weird, right? I'm pretty sure that most of the architects will disagree with that. Hey, we are a Dutch firm, we are a British firm, we're an Italian firm, but yet there is the tendency of putting the biggest continent in the world into one umbrella. Exhibitions, museums, the canon of how the things have been discussed, and it's always been Eurocentric, has always been top-down. You go to the exhibition, the only place where you hear these things is African textile design exhibition, African architecture exhibition. Yeah, but which part of Africa? Because Congo is not Morocco, Morocco is not South Africa, Ghana is not Somalia. So there is a lot of power in this, putting everything under one point of view, because obviously it diminishes and cancels all the diversity and all the beauty of that. And if this was enough and you consider this as a personal opinion, well, you just need to go to some of the recent biennales around the world. Someone will also find this a bit of a disagreement, but, from Venice, which of Carlo Ratti, which I know has been hosted in here. I wish I was in here to ask him, where was Africa in all of this? Or the Biennale of Chicago, or the Sharjah Architecture Triennale. All of these words, they give space to Africa as the periphery of the world, as, yes, we need to incorporate a bit, which, by the way, happened in the recent years. So this brings me to the point of the Pan-African Biennale, which is the Biennale that I'm now curating, that wants to not asking permission to exist, but actually reaffirm that Africa is not the periphery. The world is the periphery, has been the periphery. I just took advantage of the center of the world by exploiting it, by taking resources, by, instrumentalize the movement of people. But the reality is by 2050, 1 out of 4 people in the world will be African. The major economies will be African. The youngest population is already African. So what does that mean? It simply means that the world cannot ignore the continent. And the Pan-African Biennale was born to actually reclaim this center and showcase that architecture exists within it. With this title of this first Biennale, which is shifting the center from fragility to resilience, the intent is exactly to highlight this, to showcase there's something more than what the word so Africa exists. But how to do that? Well, through the lens of fragility, rupture from the colonial time, repetition, the cities get destroyed but yet rebuilt in the most complicated context by people, memory, keeping alive that, but also looking at the future, which, like it or not, it is African. And also doing that in a most traditional way of what the African continent is, in a nomadic way. You know, we are in a bit of a overload of biennales, at least in the global north, which is not the case of Africa, which actually never had a biennale in the history. So this will be the first one in the history of the biennale. So since 1989, when the first biennale of Venice came to life, you know, Africa never saw the stage of it. But what to do in this sense? Curation become emotion. So every 2 years we will move around, we will democratize the system, we will allow people to have access to this by moving from one nation to another, allowing students to have access to the informations by database and open sources, so that even where academics are lacking on knowledge and don't share what is happening within the continent, we can provide access to those information and becoming a platform of education. But how to do that? Well, by representing that as, again, African architecture doesn't exist. There is a continent broadly, and representing not only the continent of Africa, but also all those nations that saw the connection with the African continent, Brazil, Haiti, you know, the Middle East, and so forward. And how are we doing that? Well, we're doing that presenting the work of some of the most extraordinary architects on the continent that they didn't have the stage to present their work, but that yet, you know, from places like Cape Verde, they still have extraordinary work, like Ramos and Castellano. Work that has nothing to do with what people expect that the continent is, but yet they challenge the conception of what architecture could be also in this context. Or the work of Studio Neida from Togo, which not only did they research in terms of what modern architecture is, but they also bring exhibition to a more bottom-up approach, showcasing also their work and how this can become part of a broader discourse. Joan from Madagascar, a place where, you know, everyone knows the movie, but very few know that it is actually the nation with the highest biodiversity in the world. And is also, you know, part of one of the most interesting vernacular architecture, which she tried to transform by using materials that are locally sourced and technologically sustainable to help people to build a bit more, you know, at kilometer zero if you want to. Or a Bled El Abar collective, a collective from Tunisia, which highlight again that borders are a colonial invention and study the root of the nomadic population of Tunisia, that they move around borders by doing what? By bringing back to life the wells that this nomadic population use, and some of them have been totally out of use, forcing them to change their historical roots. And by doing that, by rebuilding and redesigning these wells, then they bring back a very important part of these people for which borders are just like a human construct. Or, last but not least, the Laboratory of Architecture and Urbanism from Guinea Equatorial, from Equatorial Guinea, which not only they work towards bringing low-cost materials and do installation for communities, but they also try to showcase the value of architecture that comes from the bottom and lift up with limited resources. Well, why all of this and why presenting this work? Because, you know, the continent of Africa has been marginalized, which is one portion of it, but the stories are being reshaped in a way that seems that the contribution of Africans and the diaspora did not exist. While in reality, if we dig in, we have people like Alessandro de' Medici, which was at the head of the Medici family in Florence, which was actually portrayed with curly hair and dark skin because it was indeed, his mother was African. Or the Alexandre Dumas of the Three Musketeers, which I think everyone has forced to read at school, which actually was written by another person of color, and so forward. So if we remove part of this contribution from the global world, including the built environment, that is denying access to education, to information, and increasing what, especially in a moment of the world where division are pushed, using architecture as a tool for creating bridges, for supporting different communities, may be one of the solutions to actually help and support broader. And this is why we also, as a Biennale, that we trying to make it bottom up. We're engaging and inviting everyone from students to practitioners to interested to be part of an inclusive moment where knowledge is shared and diversity is seen as the central core of our future development. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Omar. Well, now it's time for the panelists. I would like to present each one of you. So in the panelists, we have here on my left, Jonathan. Jonathan Subendran, a Canadian-born Elam Tamil. Sorry if I pronounce it wrong. A spatial designers and Gluon PhD researcher in the urban design section at this faculty. Grounded in anti-colonial, errant, and critically reflexive ways of working, Jonathan tries to challenge dominant design and academic norms. He is co-founder of Justice by Design, an initiative that fosters justice, literacy, and critical awareness among spatial designers. After Jonathan, we have Setareh. So Setareh Noorani is an architect, researcher, and curator at New Institute, whose practice focuses on feminist, decolonial, non-institutional, and more than human perspectives in the way we build, remember, and change cities. Setareh argues that for alternative futures that foreground underexposed voices and forms of collectivity, translating research into exhibitions, publications, and public programs. Then we have Laura. Laura Barnett is a master's architecture student at our faculty whose work focuses on the intersections between design, research, and activist practices. She's part of the Master of Architecture, a student association Argus, as well as the Board of Studies, to advocate for structural changes within the curriculum. And then we have Javier, which many of us know already in this room. Javier Arpa Fernandez is the head of the Building Audiences Group and curator of public programs and the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment. Co-author of the research and exhibition African Speculations, an Atlas of Neo-Colonial Urbanization exhibit in Kuala Lumpur, Munich, and Milan. Well, the reason because many of you are here also is because I consider them all very straightforward people. So it's the perfect panel to put together with Omar. And I would like to start then with Jonathan, because you're the closest. Would you like to bring a question?
Thanks, Omar, for your presentation. I think it's a really powerful message that you're kind of sending us. And I think what I want to ask is a question about what's happening in some parts of Africa, specifically in places like Congo and Sudan, as you know. How are you going to engage with contexts that are kind of inflicted with kind of violence and conflict and such as things like that? Like, what are you positioning yourself in the Pan-African Biennale in that context?
We start immediately with heavy questions in here, right? So I was expecting a bit more architecture stuff. Well, no, so it is a very good question, right? I think architecture is has always been a political act. You can either decide to accept it or neglect it. right? And it seems that nowadays architects run away from that political act, hiding themselves under clients, policies, governments, and so forward. Because I think there is a lot to risk when you take a position, whatever position it is, right? So it's much easier to be neutral, or at least waiting until someone else does it. In my case, to counterfight the narrative is actually providing voice to people that occupy those spaces. So in a moment where, yes, Congo and Sudan are one of the examples, right, of conflict that happens. Somalia is another. You can get that for everything, but it's one chapter of a very big book, right? In a moment where you give too much relevance to that small chapter, then all the rest seem to disappear. So what the Biennale want to do is to ally the other stories. Because that, again, as you see, the title of the Biennale is From Fragility to Resilience. But fragility and resilience are two different faces of the same coin. In fact, in the most fragile context in the world is where you find the most resilient communities that can absorb the damage the most and build it up, right? So how do I do that? I'm providing voice, I'm providing platform, and also space to having real conversation, no hiding behind, that sort of spectrum. To just highlight that. In fact, actually, the Biennale that I'm curating is not in there to promote neutrality. So if you pretend to be, neutral, you're not going to engage with this Biennale. Simple as that.
I will just stay with this mic. You go, Setareh.
Thank you, Omar, for your wonderful presentation. I already had a sneak peek this morning at the Nieuwe Institute. So I have 2 questions because I had more time to prepare myself. But the first one is more specific to architectural means, because I think we all understand architecture as an expanded practice, as a social practice. So I was wondering, what specific modes of recording, learning, and communicating architectural practice are you pushing for in the Pan-African Biennial?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think the question is, and it's always unpolite to respond with another question, but how architecture, actually contemporary architecture, responded to that? Because I think we are all in here, right? One way or another, we have been the product of the sort of Bilbao effect, if you want to, of Archistar, or of this idea that architects, they do certain designs that are intended to be objects of questionable impact, if you want to. But that is what you get pushed in faculties of architecture, right? And I think that is absolutely the opposite of what the world needs today. So we're living in a moment where climate change is affecting communities, where, economic challenges, political challenges. So what is the role of architecture? I think that is my biggest question in terms of how to develop that. The Biennale aim to, what I push the architects, which is becoming now a bit challenging, is that, okay, forget all this discourse of this intellectual discourse where, sometimes we talk, I don't even understand what they talk about. I go to exhibition of architecture without knowing what is happening in this exhibition, because I'm not able as an architect to understand that. To go back a bit to the roots of architecture, right? To the materiality, to what it solves, to how engage the communities, having workshop that can help the people understanding how buildings works. We are in a faculty of architecture, but myself, I really do challenge to know how many of you know how a brick get built, or how to actually use a brick of earth, right? We're becoming so much a theoretical practice that we forgot how actually the things are getting made. And the good thing about the continent like the one of Africa is that people have to work with materiality. The community are engaged. I always say that the most sustainable architecture practices are in the places where architects actually didn't put an eye yet. So this Biennale want to bridge that, right? It's a platform to experimentation in that sense.
And how to even, if I can follow up, this is not even a question that I had, but I'm thinking about it, how can you even translate the practice of an architect to the majority audience on the African continent? If I try to explain what an architect is to my direct family in Somalia, I have to use multiple words, so the vocabulary there is missing as well. So how are you meeting that specific challenge?
I think that is a challenge that has been created by the architects, because the language of architecture is the language of the existence of human being. We lived in shelter, we need a shelter. Like, if you think about that, you don't need to go all the way to Somalia or South Africa or whatever to understand that. You just need to go, like, in the middle of the most hyper-developed cities, and you ask, "Oh, will you employ an architect to design your house?" I was like, "No, that is too expensive. That is something that I can afford." So we become a luxury god. We're not anymore something that is a need, because we transform ourselves in an elite that I don't think it match what the world needs today, right? So yes, the language is different, but the need is in there. I think once the explanation is done by showing and not telling, then the two things change, right? I don't think there is a need to explain that you need a shelter to protect yourself from, the wind and the snow and whatever. But if I'm starting to tell you, well, you need a gable roof that it has this accent of color, people will tell you, well, so what? So I think the continent of Africa allows an opportunity that has been missed in here or forgotten in the global north, which is the one of going back to the real needs of architecture, right? I don't think that architecture, we don't have the luxury anymore to become or to keep being this sort of fancy profession. We are actually the one that I believe we can bring the solutions to the problems that the world is facing. Because, and I'm wrapping this, one data, right? The average span of life in Europe is 81, 82 years, around Europe. And between 83 to 85% of our lives is spent within buildings, which means that we do have a very big importance in the quality of life of people. That obviously goes a bit down in the global south, but it's an important matter, our profession, I believe. Yeah.
Then we move to Laura.
Okay, thank you so much, Omar, for this beautiful presentation that you gave to us and also for coming here today. So I want to give a bit more of a story of the student perspective of a student who is studying here at TU Delft. So I'm a master's student at this faculty here, and also, as Irene already mentioned, part of ARGES, which is the Association for Master's Architecture Students. And also on the Board of Studies, which is like an official body within his faculty. He's trying to change the study program in a structural way. And a bit more about my own positionality as a design student is that I try with my design to think about what it could look like in a post-capitalist world and what those aesthetics look like. And honestly, I don't really have the answers myself because that's quite a complicated question. Also with my personal life, I'm quite engaged in activism, and I'm continuously trying to relate the two. So design research and activist approach. And like me, there are a lot of students here at this faculty who really are coming from this perspective, but also sometimes struggling with practitioners or teachers who have been in the field a lot longer than us, who are telling us that this is quite a naive approach to architecture and a naive attempt at trying to solve the world, even though, of course, I have to agree that architecture cannot be the solution to the world's problems of today. But I think I agree with you that architecture is inherently political, and whatever we design as designers is a reflection of what the world is going through politically and socially. With ARGES we try to reflect upon these questions at the critical evenings and talk about how architecture is inherently an extractivist practice and how to deal with that as students. The need for critical evenings came to us last year when me and Hannah, who was on the board with me, decided that we needed a space in the faculty to talk about these things. And I've noticed that since then, like the very few attempts of scholars to also talk about these topics, and we're persevering and interested in decoloniality and trying to implement that within our educational program, have been sabotaged by outside influences in their attempts to do so, and also Subsequently, these courses were the first ones to go when it was time for budget cuts, for example. And I think this was really a pity because these courses were a great success for the people that attended it, and they were one of the first and only ones that were trying to think of how to do things differently. And there's also, talks like these and exhibitions that we have here at this faculty are good, are great, but I don't think it's enough to teach the students about these topics, because there's this problem that if you only keep it to the talks and exhibitions, then you perpetuate this idea that of the marginalization of non-Western practices, that this is only something to exhibit and not something to reflect upon critically together. Apart from extending this call to the faculty to actually hire those decolonial scholars and teach it here, I also want to ask you the question, how do you think that a Western institution like this could even engage in these questions of decoloniality? Is that our place, or do you welcome that, and how do you think about that?
Oh, this is a beautiful question. I thank you for that. So, a few things. One, and I teach as well, right? But for me, the thing is, universities are supposed to be the nest of intellectual discourse. When that doesn't happen, then the system doesn't provide a full education, and then it becomes a more directed education towards whatever is the inclination of the space, which doesn't mean that it is not 360 degree. Students have the right to demand that, because the students are the ones that actually run the institutions, even if nowadays it doesn't seem always like that. I think that also it is very naive broadly to exclude some nations or continent from the global discourse, because the reality is Europe is not the center of the discourse anymore. We're trying to hold that as much as we can, but that is not the case. I think that you're right, there's not enough offer, and the offer is not in line with the times. And why is that? I can say all these things, but it is, one, academics are broadly not prepared to what is happening in the world. They're being trained architects for a very past way of doing architecture. In fact, I'm pretty sure that even in here, my university, when I studied in Italy as well, everyone studied Le Corbusier. It's like a pillar of architecture. But no one studies Hassan Fathy, which is more contemporary than what Le Corbusier is. Yet, is that due because Le Corbusier is more important than Hassan Fathy? No, I don't believe so. It's done because there is not knowledge in how to approach the discourse around the Hassan Fathy. So that will implicate that you have to expand the horizon in that sense and create an exchange. I think that to summarize that, despite I like to be in trouble, so I think for me the whole Biennale was an act of rebellion, but not an act of rebellion towards the institutions, but towards something that is important to share. I'm not asking the permission, I'm gaining that. And I think the students, they should do the same, because I do believe, I do know that once the student body aim to achieve things, the institution cannot be turning the back on the other side, right? And this has been historically from the 60s forward, right? So if you think that you're lacking something, it's probably because you do. So that's probably a good moment to highlight, that is something that we need. But on the other hand, also supporting those faculties that actually are in the front line on trying to give you that space. Because obviously the one that is under fire more are the faculties that are trying to change this sort of elitist way historically to changing architecture. Because I don't want to say too much. Tomorrow I'm living in Delft, so I'm kicking myself out. But the thing is in today's words, is that so relevant to know architects like Renzo Piano? Yeah, maybe it is, or MVDRV, or Oma. Are they still at the center of the discussion? I'll tell you no. But then maybe other architects that will change and shape in the education of tomorrow, it's important to do that. So I think demanding that is important. So, go strong and if you need any help, I'll be more than happy to virtually join the fight.
You. Thanks.
Javier, last but not least.
Yeah. Well, I wrote several things as you were speaking, and I don't know. I don't have the time to make so many questions, but I am full of comments and ideas. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the initiative. It's time to have Africa back to the center, or Africa actually put somewhere. So I think congratulations for the initiative. That's to get started. Then I would like to go a little bit into criticizing what you're proposing. No, so your presentation starts with something which I find, speaking of the way using your words, I don't find it politically incorrect. Your presentation starts with a revision of Europeans colonizing Africa in the past. This is what Leslie Loco, which you didn't like, did a couple of years ago in Africa. No, when she in the Biennale that it was supposed to be African, which was not, etc. No, so I have the impression that we have become very comfortable in Europe as Europeans to talk about this kind of movements, talking about decolonization. It's fine. We need to talk about it. I'm not saying the opposite, but speaking of colonization and the African continent, nobody here is talking about the elephant in the room, which is China. And I don't mind saying that. So after years, I had the chance to do an investigation in Africa, and after years and years of seeing the same patterns, I wonder why don't we talk finally about the big neo-colonizer of the African territory, which is China. Extractivism, infrastructure, stadia, the African Union headquarters, the special economic zones, etc., etc. No? So I wonder if, together with what you are showing, is it possible to show the reality of a continent that is being extracted in a different manner, because it's a different way of doing it, by China? I'm fascinated by that. Really fascinating, no? And the more I read, the more I'm into it, no? I keep reading books about it. Extraction in Zambia, anyway. So, and then having been to all these new cities that are being built out of scratch, the new capital of Egypt, New Cairo, for whom, no? Or Lekki, a special economic zone next to Lagos, for whom? And Atlantic City next to Lagos, for whom? All the new towns being built in Morocco, following French patterns, for whom? No? So I wonder where that discourse is in your Biennale, if you have considered talking also about the city. No? I have seen a lot of architectural artifacts in your presentation, which are totally fine. Nothing against that, no? But at the same time, is that the only scale we should address when we organize the first Pan-African Biennale in a continent, like you said, which is going to have 25% of the population of the world will be African? That's something that you mentioned, which is striking. And that population is actually living in cities. The largest city in the world is projected to be Kinshasa, maybe Cairo, etc. No? So, and I miss that part. It's not that I don't like the other. Is that I am missing a certain reality, which is the urban growth of Africa, infrastructural projects, landscape, how about the Great Wall of Africa? I don't know. I am missing those two things, other scales. Nothing against the scales that you're showing, but I don't know if they are enough. And second, when we are talking about decolonizing, how about China? Not to talk about also imported models from the Persian monarchies, no? The Dubai, the Qatar, the Saudi, etc., that are also trying to replicate certain urban models, or Singapore, certain urban models, for whom, no? I am missing, it's more a comment or a question, but I'm missing that really very much in your idea for the Biennale.
Well, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for many things, because one, you literally just proved my point of the whole presentation, which again, the point that you highlighted, seeing Africa as a place of extraction and not as a place of production. So for me, I'm not excluding nothing, and you don't miss nothing, because how can you miss something that didn't happen yet? We can put this in hold. You can come to me in September, and I would love to have this conversation once again, because I think it's important to remember that you can say that there are suggestions that I didn't highlight, which doesn't mean that I have avoided or I'm avoiding to curate, right? But again, your point of view is extraction. I have interest, of course, to present that, but why do I have to talk about now in a moment where the intention is actually to showcase the other side of the coin, the resilience part, not the fragility part. Beside the intervention of, you mentioned China, which is, neocolonization, and I can argue that neocolonize or new colonize the whole world. The phone that you have is made on China. The computer they use is made on China. So it's a European as part of that, right? But that is the thing. But also is a part of Zambia is the extreme case. But there are nations in Africa that are not touched by China, not even a little, right? I think for me, if the critic is decolonization and stuff, and you mention people that do that, I think it's great. But again, as this is the first edition, right, it's comparable with nothing because it hasn't been done, but yet it set the ground to do something, right? There's no metric of evaluation on something that hasn't been done already. All the metric of evaluation that are used are European models that we can take something, that myself am taking something, but they're not a right comparison system. And I think on that point, again, what I showcase are not projects that would be showcased in the Biennale. Is an idea. Because I see, when I mentioned that you prove a point for me, is that the idea is always to see Africa as a place of extraction, as a place where things are getting taken away, as a place where freedom is taken away, infrastructure, economic is taken away, whatever it is, neocolonization, new colonization, whatever. But it's not seen on the other part of it. What actually is Africa contributing? What is the relationship that comes from that population and what is happening? And I think my role as the curator of this is to be very firm in, yes, come with your ideas, whatever are the ideas, which are dictated by an educational system, by experience, also because Africa is still a very gray area, right? We don't know much of what is happening, we don't know much of what is the production. I'm pretty sure that none of maybe one or two people knew that Equatorial Guinea has architecture production in there. But yet, there is a reality of that counterfight, right? Will the Biennale talk about cities? 100%. But in which way, I think, is the right question to understand how the city will be taught. Technology, futures, use of AI, all of these are part of the discourse.
But then the presentation is full of omissions. That's what I mean. I have the impression that it would have been really, really nice that if we start with a narrative of past colonialism, that we also mention that just to frame the entire context. I'm talking about omissions in a research. That's all I'm saying, because otherwise, if we don't mention really what is actually happening right now, one gets to the point of, also because we have been talking about decolonizing, you have also mentioned that, but what is neocolonialism doing right away, especially in a context like the African territory, And also, I think that it would have been really interesting to see what happens in cities. At least those are maybe my fascinations. But when I only see one period of history and one certain scale or one certain approach to urbanization, I am missing all that.
But again, we're talking about something that it didn't happen yet. So your questions will be very valuable in October. So if in October you can keep those in, and I'll be more than happy to have this dialogue again and see if all the points that you raised they were missing. But again, what is missing is that your perspective that see that, and I want to challenge you in that. Is that because you tickle on what you know, or it is because you tickle on what is needed? Because the two things, I'm not sure that are coming together. If I'm going to an African from the Congo or the Guinea-Conakry or Senegal, probably their concern is not that much the infrastructure of China in certain places, which it could be, right? But it's be like, how do we house the working class? How do we facing like the climate change or the movement of people? So, I think my invite is to remember once that this conversation is great and the critics are great, because the critics implicate the fact that something, according to what you said, is missing, which then allows me to use that to tell you, okay, if you think that is missing, come and see it. and then we can have the discourse, right? So if something is missing, is it a part of the discussion that is missing, or is a part of knowledge sharing that is missing, right? So that for me is, talking about neocolonialism, okay, great, it's fine. We can have that. The colonial part, why the colonial part is important? Because it actually destroyed the whole story of a continent, right? Then we can argue the why, I guess.
I'll stop because
No, but
we can continue.
Yes, otherwise I have to intervene.
Actually, connecting to what Javier is saying, I'm trying to spin it in a different way because indeed what would be really interesting already for this pitch, but specifically for audiences here, are these core questions, right, that African cities are grappling with at this point, specifically because a lot of Dutch architecture firms, like an OMA, has been conducting research for the past decades into the African continent, which has in some ways overshadowed what we are, I think, trying to learn now from the African continent. I've seen recently the Countryside 2 exhibition in Qatar, and I find it still quite, how do you say it, it's a really invigorating display on the level of questions that are being asked, but then it never really gives me a particular perspective from the bottom up itself. So then I'm also wondering how the Pan-African Biennial, also knowing that the research is still undergoing, and I'm very empathetic to that, but what kind of questions on the ground are you considering? And what's if I can connect to the archive that you want to build, what's the archive of responses that you're trying to curate here in relation to the questions from bottom up?
Well, assuming that everything in terms of research has to respond to some question, right? Sometimes there are moments where sharing already something create a discussion around it. And when that something is missing, you can't even question it, nothing, right? So that is what I see the archival in that sense. So assuming that we want to create discussion and what is those questions that you set on the ground, each one of the participants have to respond to certain prompt, right? Fragility is broader. The Biennale tend to have like a team, and then people revolve around that. In this case, I built micro teams that each one of the nation differently can connect. The colonization is just one. There is sustainability. What is the concept of sustainability for Africa? What is the materiality? What does it mean climate change for islands like, Comor? What does it mean using of materiality, where the materials are coming, right? What does it mean developing new cities as they're happening, but also mitigate the one that will become mega cities like Mogadishu, Lagos, Nairobi, and so forward, right? So all of these, they're coming under the umbrella of this fragility of the continent. But the architects, they will share their knowledge and understanding within their context of how they're working towards solving them. Some, they created workshops to sensibilize community and students on working with earth and be more close to say, like, I prefer to use this material, and not just say, I want a glass and concrete because in London they do that. But starting to educate in terms of what is the importance of using different materials, right? So there is a sphere of intention, but also discussion like the one that we're having, right? How to curate about Africa, how to talk about Africa. But also aid. What is the aid? Why the handbook of international aid guideline are prompted by non-continental partitioners? Why is that imposed? Or how do you create that balance between rural and urban? Because I think a continent offers the chance to look from the Western world and learning from the mistake and avoiding those mistakes, right? So all of these are questions that will be taking place, but under the terms of who? Not under the terms of the curator, not under the terms of the academics, but under the people that actually work in the context. I tell to all the practitioners, look, this is the framework. You can paint whatever it is within this. You can be, as truthful as it is, as radical as it is, but responding to this question so then we can move forward. Look, another example, and I'm wrapping up, right, is the use of AI, right? I'm pretty sure that a lot of you remember when Black Panther came out. For the first time, Hollywood allows to have a portrait of cities of Africa that is different from what has been the concept of that, right? But that was created, that dialogue between C5 writers that envision cities that do not exist yet, with the dialogue with architects of tomorrow, right? So some of the panel that we will have, we put together these C5 writers, African C5 writers, with architects to start to have an exchange of, okay, can we actually work with this vision? Can we build something different? Because I think also the model to approach to the city development and architecture could change. So we will do some experimentation, but I think for me, I'm totally up for failure as long as you fail forward. And then we get better and better with time.
I'm gonna open the floor. It's time for the audience to also participate. So I would like to ask, is there someone who has a question? Okay. I'm gonna start there.
Hi. First, I'd really like to thank you for your talk. Being Somali myself, it was amazing to see this. But I just wanted to ask, in the context of African architecture, I think the tools of architectural knowledge dissemination are just as important as the actual knowledge being shared. And for a lot of African cultures, that knowledge is often shared through non-tangible or non-standardized ways. And do you intend to present those knowledge channels in your biennale and also the architecture that it results in? And if so, did you have to take any precautions for it or keep anything in mind?
The archive itself, which is a documentation of all this information, will also include oral spaces as well, right? Because that is important. I think one of the reasons because history was easily taken away in a sense is because a lot of tradition within the continent are oral transmitted, right? So I think the technology allows today for us to capture those through videos, through audio, and in fact, some of the participants are using audio and sounds to share that. It is a very important part. The framework of architecture, the schools in architecture in Africa are very young. I think the oldest one being the South African one, the Wits University, right? So the intention is to actually showcase what is also the sort of architecture of surviving, if you want to, the nomadic architectures, the vernacular architecture, and see where the exchange and the bridge can be achieved. So, long story short, yes.
There were here Jill Sabine, maybe there she's closer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation and discussion so far. I'm looking forward to the Pan-African Biennale. Because you're here in our space here as a guest, I would like to maybe come back to the topic of the institution, what the institution means, what it can do in the context of decolonization, teaching about decolonization. And maybe take it a bit further in a sense that, because you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned that at a point when university faculty doesn't provide freedom of knowledge exchange, of scholarship, that it doesn't do its job, basically. Is this how I understood it correctly?
Yeah, I basically meant that the offer should broader, right? And should be allowed the student to at least have an understanding of all the work.
To give them platform for those who want to speak, and the students can demand spaces for learning about colonial practices and so on.
Yeah, even not just simply architecture, right?
Yeah, so I would actually like to talk about what has for the past 2 years, since we are watching live stream genocide and destruction of Palestine, has been real elephant in the room, I would like to shift to that because exactly, I think, more than a year ago, an event featuring all Palestinian scholars was supposed to take place here in this very spot, and it was brutally cancelled. There was kind of a silence after that about that event, not as if nothing happened, and it is quite typical for universities across West. And then there was a course a year ago, actually beginning this year, called Architecture and Colonialism. And it had brilliant exhibition after that course where students didn't dare to even put their names publicly, which should be an outrageous invitation for all the scholars and people working here as an invitation to discuss why is that happening. The course, unfortunately, is, as Laura mentioned, not going to be reinstated, even though students are expressing their interest, and there's obviously a burning need for such space. So I wonder, because you said, the institution does not only provide that space, but it actively works to neutralize, or even, maybe better say it works performatively, perhaps to give such space, or gives a small measure of such space and then cancels it. So I'm wondering about the active role of space like this in actually working performatively in ways of decolonization. So I wonder what you think about this.
Well, I think a lot of things about this. So I think that today, more than probably ever, or at least again as before, it's important to resist certain actions, right? I think knowledge broadly is not right or wrong. It's just knowledge, right? Sharing practices and educate yourself. Nothing bad comes out from education, at least in my experience, right? If something, it comes out bad when you don't have enough education. I think without getting too much into what institutions do or not do, right? I think I firmly believe in the power of bottom-up actions, right? I do believe, look, the Biennale itself, to give an example that I can frame it a bit better, right? The number of people that told me it can't be done, it has been overwhelming. But I think that is in relation to the fact that certain people cannot do that. So just because you don't do that doesn't mean that I can't. Just because you don't want to teach that doesn't mean that I don't have to learn it, right? So there are always a bubble of resistance wherever you are. I think that the tricky part is to find those strong bubble of resistance and finding the faculty member that actively wanted to support students' body, right? Or access to the informations. For me, the Biennale will offer space to that. Actually, the opposite. If you wanted to play soft, I'm not interested in that. And that is related to, to conflicts, to displacement, to migration, to, lack of understanding of the importance of diversity. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
perhaps just to add to that, the problem is that these rare voices, which you also in your presentation at one point, you talk about rupture. They indeed were rupture, perhaps, in this, space. They are deemed as activist voices, as if they are not doing their ethical duty of, transmitting knowledge or teaching about stuff they know. So they are labeled as activists, as if they are outside of the knowledge space, almost. So it's quite aggressive approach to these voices, at least in Western spaces, what we experienced so far.
Well, for me, like the best advice that I can give you, and this is the advice that I received by myself, is be the change that you want to see in the world. Be the one, remember every day that you can actually be that drop that make the water change direction. Because I think that there's nothing worse than be passive recipient of things. So, there is a problem, great. I mean, I navigate with problems is exactly what I made a profession out of, right? Find the solution to those problems. But have one person that has an idea is just one person, but then when become 10 is a collective, when become 1,000 is a movement. So everything starts with that one. There's no difference between the 1,000 and 0. It's just that one person that takes the initiative to do that. So be that person.
She is. She really is. We had also here Amber and Jill, and there 2, 3. Okay, we have to maybe have more mics around.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting, and what I'm feeling somehow in the room also is that there is a need for us to understand the continent of Africa and their practices in their own terms, and I think that's what you are doing with the Biennale, and this is also, I think, why it's hard for us to understand, and all these questions come regarding to your curation. And so I'm actually thinking, now you are here, you come to a Western institution to talk about this Biennale, Pan-African Biennale, and I just want to know from you, what do you want us to do as students? What do you want us as new practitioners to do with this? Do you want us to engage with the Biennale? Is there any tips from your side also in how we engage as Western practitioners, for example, in this? Is it even our place? All these questions also relate to responsibility. If we're talking about neo-colonialism, this is also still happening in Europe. So how can we relate to these topics and also actually relate to your Biennale?
Well, so me myself, I had to be truthful to the fact that I myself a Western practitioner that then is also African practitioner in that, right? So I bridge the two words in that sense, which I think is the representation of how is the global world work now, right? There are bridges, even if nowadays it seems in things like Europe that we're losing the freedom of movement and so forth, but this has been a point of strength, right? What I'm trying to do differently, I think, with the Biennale for me is, or maybe not that different, but is to see that as just a temporary thing. Like the exhibition per se is the least meaningful thing for me. What is that actually is important out of that is the discussion that will come out of it, the inclusion that will come out of it. Like why I'm doing now this sort of grand tour of global North institutions is to actually sensibilize a bit, one, sharing that work that it has been done and is going on, but also allowing to create those collaborations. So the Biennale for me is for everyone. It allows, people like yourself, if you wanted to get engaged in some capacity, there is space for people to get engaged like that. Is a space to share knowledge, to have a workshop, to, volunteer for the Biennale. So I think for me what is important is to offer an alternative that I shouldn't be offering, but is an alternative that doesn't exist yet. So I think the Biennale covered the gap that was not present, right? How then we engage with this gap is up to us. For me, for students, what I'm expecting the student is to have critical thinking. I always tell that to my students as well. Go behind what the professor is telling you. Because the professor is a human being as well. He has his experience, as everyone else, the knowledge, but what there is behind. Maybe you find that your interest in exploring the architecture of South America, or maybe is rehabilitate a small town in rural Holland that your grandparents come from. I don't know, whatever it is in that, I think you need to find those bridges. What I am offering to each one of you is a portion of that bridge with the African continent. And hopefully that will allow us to put in touch with practitioners, with experience. Maybe one day, Irene would take the students to do a travel to one of the African countries, Nairobi 2026, and bringing the students and taking part of a workshop, right? So we're building this broadly together. My question is for you, what do you want to do for the Biennale? You have a thought about that, and you tell me, and I'll be more than happy to facilitate that.
It will be an option.
Hey, listen.
Jill. Yeah, sorry. I had also Jill around.
Perhaps multiple questions can be taken.
Yeah, maybe we take 3 questions. You don't remember that? No, if it's one by one.
I think actually my question relates to Amber's question we just had. I'm thinking a lot about how can we as Western planners kind of aid to this journey towards decoloniality, which we've been describing here in the courses, and it's a bit of a fight here at TU Delft as a Western institution where these courses are often budgeted out. And what I really struggle with is how do we as students rebel and resist and go find this knowledge in a way that is not still extractivist. This is something I struggle with in my own project as well, where I found the opportunity to go and chase this knowledge, but it took it brought me to an African country where I did meet an amazing community who taught me so many things, but then I'm struggling to bring that knowledge into actual practice that will also give that back to them. So how do you suggest maybe we navigate this boundary and duality of wanting to help and wanting to add to and contribute, but also the extractivism that kind of almost automatically seems to come with that?
So first of all, it wasn't the plan for my night to support rebellions in architecture. That was not what I started with. So I think is a matter of the place that you start to, right? On the other spectrum of things, in the global north has been pushed this narrative where, they almost makes you fearful of having a dialogue with the global south because you come in, they tell you come from a place of privilege and knowledge and So that makes everyone uncomfortable when actually most of the time there is no need to be uncomfortable. As long as there is understanding that yes, you're coming with a lot of knowledge, but you're coming also with a lot of lack of knowledge. So, I think what we always talked, and what for me is important, is the canon of observation, right? So if there was this beautiful book, I think it was Germ, Guns, and War, or something like that. If you evaluate, your skills based on what you are used to, you excel on that. But then you need to change that, right? So I think it's a matter of how you approach to that. If it's a knowledge share, that's totally fine. You share something, you're great. I mean, Holland is great in a lot of things. Italy is great in other things. Kenya is doing great in other stuff. So as long as there is the share, there is an equal share at the table, we're all seated at the same, on the same chair, that's fine. But then if someone is spaced higher and someone lower, that is where the mechanism is. So for me, approach with free minds. You're a student. You study. You're in a university. The intellectual thing shouldn't be a concern. Ask questions, and there's no. I think I always say that there are not stupid questions. There are only stupid answers. So if they make you uncomfortable, is the person that gave you an answer, not you asking a question. So just ask more, engage more, and I think there's no problem with that.
Thank you. Shall we gather these 3 questions? Can we gather 3 questions?
Yeah. If they're not too complex, you can help me.
I can help you, yeah.
All right. Oops. Thanks, Omar, for your presentation. I have a question regarding the resilience word that you kept saying, because I think it's a tricky word to work with, because I think we tend to romanticize communities' resilience, and we forget that resilience comes after a crisis, or it's an act of bouncing back from a thing that happened. And it's communities usually are resilient because they are lacking something, and they are, most of the time, it's part of their basic human needs in some contexts. So my question is this word, so over-romanticizing those practices and then forgetting about the fact that those communities actually lacking their housing rights, for instance, their ways to get water, or I come from a very fragile context as well, and when I was researching, I had this kind of tendency to, documenting and romanticizing and those acts of resilience. And I'm but they are doing that because they lack their basic human needs. So I don't know, how do you work with that?
Shall we gather the questions first?
Sorry. Yes. Yes. That
I have
a good reminder.
Go ahead.
Hi, Omar. Thanks for the presentation. You just gave us a glimpse. I want to bring it back to exhibitions, not related to resilience. It's a different topic, a different question, basically. So, you kept us yearning for more, longing for more to see what this exhibition is going to bring in 2026, in September 2026. And you mentioned all the different others, biennales, which I found out there, like Venezia, the one in Chicago, Sharjah. So my question is, how does the Pan-African Biennale position itself in comparison to the other biennales that have been fully focused on Africa. I completely agree. Kalorati's Biennale did not mention Africa, or other biennales did not, but the one of Loco in 2023 very much was Africa focused. So what makes that, what are the differences and similarities, and how would you position the Pan-African Biennale?
Thank you for this question. I was just waiting for this.
You're waiting for it.
I was waiting for this.
Sorry. The third one, and then we do a round.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you for the presentation, and I also really like that you started with Africa in the center. So I have a question to you. I feel like a lot of diasporic communities and African communities are dealing with imposter syndrome. We are looking to the West, we are looking to modernism and say, this is the way to build. And now I have the feeling we try to promote a lot of vernacular architecture, a lot of African architecture, but is this a battle that we should fight inside of the global, or in the global stage, or in the African stage? Because our own communities are still a bit having doubts on how to use vernacular architecture. Is this the way of building? And how do we tackle that? And how would you do that with the Pan-African Biennale?
You choose how do you start.
These are awesome questions, by the way. So I'm going to start with what is the easiest one for me, which is the one of resilience, right? So I don't romanticize that at all, but it's getting romanticized in the moment where you exclude fragility from the picture. So if I'm only talking about resilience, then I'm talking about only the positive thing, right? But in reality, for me, what is important, I never mention one without the other because they come as a package, right? There's no community, it doesn't matter if it's a global south or a global north, that doesn't have a neighborhood that is fragile, you know, or a neighborhood that is more resilient than others, right? And obviously it's related to the response to a crisis. You can't be resilient if you didn't have a crisis that made you resilient, right? But for me, I'm interested in the connection between the two, right? Where is the transition in there? What is happening in the moment where an extremely fragile or forgotten community has to survive and move forward? And how do you move away from that surviving day-by-day mentality to actually looking towards something that is behind the day after? I think that is the kind of the response we have to do, right? Because there is fragility, there is resilience, and then there is the future. But what is this future? How is the future can remove these two and make it? Because fragility will always exist and resilience will always exist. But what is the spectrum of those, right? So the idea is, how do you reduce that spectrum of movement between resilience and fragility? So the romanticization, I'm actually trying to do the opposite than romanticize that. I'm allowing the architects to be totally free to share whatever it is, the most problems that they have, but also how they're trying to find a solution, or how they're looking for a solution that they can't find, because that is also a thing. Again, I think this is a beautiful discussion to have, but the romanticization of it is not what I want to do, especially in a context where, you know, has been done enough for romanticization. I mean, it has been done probably more romanticization of the fragility of the African continent with the, you know, the famous UN or UNICEF with the baby, you know, malnutrition and the fly, and it's like, donate money to this. Like, that is a instrumentalization of it. So hopefully that will change. But it's a good point. We'll see. I keep that with me all the time, though. Well, so let's go to yours because it's fascinating. It's very fascinating. So you asked me about the Biennale and what the Biennale do, and then talking about the fact that other Biennales, they actually put Africa a lot in the discourse, right? Right, more or less?
More, not putting it in discourse. Actually, I understand that other biennales mention Africa in the discourse. But my question is what positions your biennale is different to the other full African biennale that is fun events? Events 2023.
Oh, you're referring to the Loco Biennale. So you want to, okay, so you really want me to get in there. Okay, I like that. So one, mine isn't a biennale in Africa, first thing first. I'm not going in Venice to trying to, you know, to compromise in that sense. Two, I will actually invite you to see what is the provenience of those African architects that actually took part in that. Majority are, from the diaspora, they work abroad, they are engaging with not less relevant, but very different contexts, right? And I find it also concerning that almost to think that I have to relate, or like people push me to relate to actually a biennale. This is a European biennale. Like I don't see the comparison, because there's no comparison. I'm running a biennale in Africa with all the partitioners, which has never been done in the history of architecture, to putting all of these partitioners from the continent together. The rest, it become for me a periphery of the discourse. Did that open the door? I don't know. They opened the door probably in a very European way of allowing space. But let me ask you this. If you go to I'm sure that you've been to the Biennale of Venice multiple times, and if you go to the Arsenale, where there are the permanent pavilions, can you tell me what pavilions is missing? Yeah, but Qatar is not Africa, right? It's Middle East. So I'm saying, the whole continent is represented at the Biennale of Venice, beside the African continent. Yet you have African partitioners that go to do exhibitions within the European pavilions. Am I wrong? There are I don't want to go directly and call out people, but there is this tendency. So what is really Africa? It's like Africa was the periphery, was allowed a bit of space. Everyone was happy with being given that space, obviously, because what is better than going to Venice? I'm not doing that. I don't see the comparison. I mean, the term biennale has been used simply because in the language it means every 2 years. That's the only communality that there is. What is going to happen after, I guess we'll see after September, which you will come to see.
Sorry, we need to... But you can discuss later. To finish the third question?
I forgot. I told you that I was going to forget one.
We're about talking... You started from the imposter syndrome.
Yeah. The African imposter syndrome, where we think a lot of modernist architecture are building with concrete in these contexts where concrete is not suitable. Yeah. How do we tackle that problem with our own African communities and with our own diaspora communities?
Yeah. So, well, I fought with that quite a bit, because I think I had to re-educate myself and the more I keep actually doing that, the more I discover things that I didn't know that were even in there. So, and that I think is part of the matter. What I think is important to say that everyone belong. If someone is make you feel that you don't belong, they are the one that don't belong to the space, because who are you to tell me that I can't be in here or designing in here or be part of it? So I think what I'm inviting to in the moment, and this is, by the way, is a reminder, I think, with the education question. If you feel imposter syndrome, is probably because you don't see enough representation of certain places or certain technicality or certain projects, which then again is a problem, as an educational problem broadly, I would say. But I think that no one should ask the permission to belong, especially nowadays.
Thank you. Javier, do I have time for a fast question? I think Jonathan is itching. Very, very short.
Quick question.
Yes.
As a curator, I think Javier probably also experiences with the Indigenous Practices exhibition. You have a lot of people submitting and want to be involved. How do you know who gets to be involved and who doesn't get to be involved?
That is a tricky question. I think it's very complicated, because, like it or not, you're going to make someone unhappy. I think in a momentum where this hasn't been done, a lot of people want to get engaged, but there is like a bit of balance that has been done to be allowing people to showcase the work, but also because, as it was saying, you have to balance with the other biennale too. I really want to share the message that there is a lot of quality that doesn't need to, to feel like shy by having a direct confrontation with great architecture offices. So I think also you divide that a bit, yeah.
Thank you for the short answer. I need to close in 2 minutes. One thing I want to mention, of course, before thanking everyone, I felt we came here trying to discuss what the Biennale is, and I leave myself with a feeling of this Biennale is a movement. It's an idea, it's a way of starting a discussion. And it should not be only performative, so we need to act on it. But I'm really grateful you came here to this faculty. and you activated this debate, and that is contested. And I think if it will not be controversial, it will not be an actual debate. So I'm very happy for that. I'm also thankful for the panelists to join and to be bold in the questions. And of course, to all of you to come and join us, and for the whole online people joining us too. And do I have to announce next event? Tomorrow there is another big talk, so we are this week lucky. And for the rest, I think, Omar, you have left us your contact and the Biennale contact.
Well, and thank you so much for having me, and also keep me accountable. So I would be happy to have this conversation again 1 year from now, because it's important to be accountable of the success, but more important of the failure. And if you want to reach me, you know how to reach me. It's quite easy.
Thank you so much.